8,000 Russian Naval Infantry. 1 American island base defended by 3,000 Marines. 14 hours of amphibious assault that military historians now call bloodiest beach landing since World War II. Russian commanders committed their elite maritime forces to Operation Doctrine said should succeed through overwhelming numbers and coordinated fires. American defenders occupied positions intelligence assessed as inadequate to withstand sustained assault by force, nearly 3 times their size. What transpired over those 14 hours wasn't just failed amphibious operation. It was systematic destruction of attacking force that rewrites every assumption about modern amphibious warfare and defensive capabilities when one side possesses advantages the other never anticipated encountering. But the reason why 8,000 Russian naval infantry suffered catastrophic casualties attempting to storm island, defended by 3,000 Marines, has nothing to do with superior American firepower or better defensive positions. It was one weapon system American forces deployed that Russian planners didn't know existed operationally and couldn't counter once encountered. And understanding what that system actually does requires waiting for revelation that changes everything about amphibious assault doctrine and anti-ship defense in literal warfare. Just weeks ago, Russian Pacific Fleet Command authorized amphibious assault to seize American forward operating base on strategic island controlling sea lanes critical to both nations. Intelligence indicated American garrison numbered approximately 3,000 Marines with limited heavy weapons and no naval support within range to provide timely reinforcement. Russian planners assessed 8,000 naval infantry, supported by naval gunfire, and aviation could overwhelm American defenses through coordinated assault. That doctrine emphasizes as decisive approach to amphibious operations. Attack would occur during limited window when American carrier group was deployed elsewhere, leaving island garrison isolated and vulnerable. Every operational factor favored Russian success: numerical superiority, naval fire support, air cover, and enemy isolation, creating conditions where amphibious doctrine predicted decisive victory. What Russian planners didn't know was that American defensive capabilities on island included weapons system specifically designed to defeat amphibious assault that Russian intelligence hadn't detected because system remained classified and had never been employed operationally before this engagement. Welcome to the Navy Chronicle, where naval power meets historical reality. Planning phase. Russian amphibious task force included 8,000 naval infantry embarked on amphibious assault ships with supporting naval vessels providing fire support and air defense. Assault plan followed standard doctrine. Preparatory naval bombardment to suppress defenses. Helicopter insertion of advance forces to secure landing zones, followed by amphibious vehicles delivering main assault force to establish beachhead-enabling follow-on operations. Intelligence preparation identified American defensive positions, including bunkers, artillery, and suspected anti-ship missile batteries. Fire support plans allocated naval guns and aircraft to suppress known defenses during assault. Every element of Russian planning was professional and doctrinally sound. Commanders were confident 8,000 naval infantry could overwhelm 3,000 Marines through sustained assault, that American forces lacked capability to resist indefinitely. Critical assumption underlying Russian planning was that American defenses consisted of conventional weapons that Russian fires could suppress, enabling successful landing. Hour 0. Russian task force arrived at assault position. Naval bombardment commenced targeting identified American defensive positions. Shells impacted fortifications and suspected weapon locations for 30 minutes, delivering substantial ordnance designed to suppress American fires during landing. American positions took damage, but Marines remained combat effective through hardened construction and dispersion. When bombardment lifted, Russian helicopters launched carrying advance forces to secure landing zones inland from beaches. That's when American defenses revealed capability Russian planners hadn't anticipated. Surface-to-air missiles engaged Russian helicopters with accuracy and lethality that Russian air defense doctrine hadn't prepared them to counter. Multiple helicopters were destroyed before reaching landing zones. Surviving aircraft aborted insertion, returning to ships without delivering advance forces. Russian commanders were surprised by American air defense effectiveness, but assessed it was acceptable loss, proceeding with main amphibious assault. Hour 2. Russian amphibious vehicles began approach to beaches carrying main assault force. Standard doctrine has amphibious vehicles, both tracked BTR-80s and wheeled variants. Transit from ships to shore under covering fire from naval guns and remaining aviation assets. Vehicles approached in waves designed to overwhelm defenses through volume of forces, landing simultaneously across multiple beaches. That approach had succeeded in Russian exercises and historical operations. It failed catastrophically against American island defense. As Russian vehicles crossed from deep water into littoral zone, American forces engaged with weapon system Russian commanders didn't know Americans possessed on island. Autonomous underwater vehicles armed with anti-ship missiles rose from seabed, engaging Russian amphibious ships and landing craft at ranges where Russian defenses couldn't effectively respond. Missiles struck ships carrying reserves and supplies, creating explosions that damaged multiple vessels and killed hundreds of naval infantry before they'd reached beaches. Russian assault force was suffering severe casualties before landing any troops. Hour 4. Russian commanders recognized their amphibious vehicles were being systematically destroyed by underwater threats their doctrine hadn't prepared them to counter. Some vehicles reached beaches but were immediately engaged by American anti-armor fires. Marines positioned in fortified positions engaged landing Russians with machine guns, mortars, and precision fires. Russian casualties on beaches were enormous. Troops attempting to exit destroyed vehicles found themselves under accurate fire from positions they couldn't locate or suppress. Russian doctrine assumes amphibious assault will suffer casualties during landing, but casualties should be sustainable if sufficient forces reach shore to establish beachhead. This assault was producing catastrophic casualties, preventing any cohesive beachhead from forming. Naval infantry, who survived landing, were pinned on beaches unable to advance inland or withdraw to sea. Russian fire support attempted to suppress American positions but couldn't locate underwater vehicles that continued engaging Russian ships and landing craft. But here's where engagement reveals what made American defense so devastatingly effective. Those autonomous underwater vehicles weren't just carrying anti-ship missiles. They were networked with American defensive systems on island, creating integrated fire control that allowed Marines to cue underwater vehicles against highest priority targets, while underwater vehicles provided targeting data about Russian ship movements back to shore-based systems. That networking meant American defense operated as single integrated system rather than independent weapons engaging targets of opportunity. Russian forces faced defensive network where every element supported every other element through real-time data sharing that Russian doctrine hadn't anticipated or prepared them to counter. When Russian commanders repositioned ships to avoid underwater threats, shore-based systems engaged them. When Russian forces attempted landing at different beaches to escape concentrated fires, underwater vehicles redeployed tracking Russian movements and engaging from unexpected positions. Hour 6. Russian assault had stalled completely. Thousands of naval infantry were casualties either killed during approach, destroyed on landing craft, or pinned on beaches under sustained fire. Russian naval commanders faced decision about whether to continue operations accepting additional losses or withdraw preserving remaining forces. Doctrine says failed amphibious assault should be terminated before losses become unsustainable. But political and military pressures made withdrawal difficult after committing 8,000 elite naval infantry to operation assessed as achievable. Russian commanders ordered renewed assault, with remaining forces attempting different approach, using remaining helicopters and landing craft simultaneously to overwhelm American defenses through coordinated timing. That final assault encountered same integrated defensive system that had destroyed previous waves. More Russian helicopters were shot down. More landing craft were sunk by underwater vehicles. More naval infantry died on beaches under marine fires. Hour 10. Russian commanders terminated assault operations and began withdrawal. Surviving naval infantry attempted to evacuate from beaches where they'd been pinned for hours. American forces continued engaging withdrawing Russians, inflicting additional casualties. Russian naval vessels provided covering fire, enabling some evacuation. But many naval infantry were left behind, either dead, wounded, or unable to reach extraction points under fire. Final Russian casualties exceeded 4,000 killed or wounded out of 8,000 committed. 50% casualty rate that military doctrine considers catastrophic loss, rendering unit combat ineffective. American casualties were under 300. Remarkable defensive success against force, nearly 3 times their size, that should have overwhelmed defensive positions through sustained assault. Hour 14. Russian forces had completely withdrawn. American Marines controlled island with Russian assault completely defeated. Strategic assessment concluded. American defense demonstrated capability that changes calculations about amphibious operations against prepared defenders with advanced defensive systems. Russian Naval Infantry, elite maritime force trained specifically for amphibious assault, had been destroyed, attempting Operation Doctrine said should succeed. That outcome wasn't because Russian planning was incompetent or forces inadequately trained. Russian operation followed sound doctrine with adequate forces. They were defeated by defensive capability. Russian intelligence hadn't detected, and Russian doctrine hadn't prepared them to counter. Now for revelation that reframes entire engagement. Remember those autonomous underwater vehicles that devastated Russian assault? Those weren't standard weapons system deployed openly on island. They were classified prototype weapons that had been positioned secretly, specifically because intelligence indicated Russian amphibious assault was probable. American Strategic Command had authorized deploying experimental system because political and military leadership assessed losing island was unacceptable and conventional defenses might be insufficient against Russian numerical superiority. Autonomous underwater vehicles had been delivered covertly weeks before assault and positioned underwater where Russian reconnaissance couldn't detect them. When Russian assault began, Americans activated system that had never been used operationally, proving its effectiveness catastrophically against Russian forces who had no doctrine or countermeasures for threats they didn't know existed. Russian intelligence failure to detect classified weapons deployment meant Russian planning was based on assessment of American capabilities that was fundamentally wrong, creating conditions where Russian forces assaulted, defended position without understanding actual defensive capabilities they would encounter. Think about implications for amphibious warfare doctrine and operational security. Russian forces conducted professional amphibious operation using sound doctrine with adequate forces. But they were defeated by weapon system their intelligence hadn't detected and their doctrine couldn't counter. Future amphibious operations face fundamental problem. How can attackers plan when defenders might possess classified capabilities that intelligence hasn't detected? Russian disaster demonstrates that amphibious assault against prepared defender is extraordinarily risky when defender might employ unexpected capabilities that negate attackers' numerical and firepower advantages. That changes calculations about whether amphibious operations remain viable in an era where defensive technologies can be deployed, covertly creating capabilities that attacking forces discover only when engaged by weapon systems they didn't know they'd face. For Russian military, this engagement revealed catastrophic intelligence failure and doctrinal inadequacy. Their intelligence assessment of American defensive capabilities was wrong because they didn't detect classified weapons deployment. Their amphibious doctrine was inadequate because it didn't prepare forces for encountering autonomous underwater threats that doctrine didn't account for existing. Future Russian amphibious operations face problem that intelligence might miss classified capabilities and doctrine might be inadequate against unexpected threats. That creates operational paralysis where commanders cannot be confident in planning, because hidden defensive capabilities might make operations suicidal. Russian Naval Infantry learned that lesson through catastrophic casualties, demonstrating vulnerability of amphibious forces when defenders possess unexpected technological advantages. For American military, this engagement validated controversial decision to deploy experimental weapons system in operational setting. Autonomous underwater vehicles proved devastatingly effective, creating defensive capability that Russian forces couldn't counter. Future American defensive planning will incorporate lessons about covert deployment of advanced systems, creating strategic surprise that conventional defenses cannot achieve. But success also creates vulnerability. Russian forces now know such systems exist and will develop countermeasures. American advantage demonstrated here was temporarily created by fielding classified capability before opponents develop counters. That advantage persists only while technological lead remains, and operational security prevents opponents from developing effective countermeasures. The broader lesson applies across all military operations. Technological advantages, including classified systems, can be decisive when employed against opponents who haven't developed doctrine or countermeasures for capabilities they didn't know existed. Russian amphibious assault was defeated not through conventional superiority, but through deploying advanced system that Russian intelligence hadn't detected and Russian doctrine couldn't counter. That demonstrates persistent value of classified weapons programs that create capabilities opponents don't know about until tactical employment reveals them. But such revelations are one-time advantages, because once capabilities are revealed through combat employment, opponents develop countermeasures, reducing future effectiveness. Which factor dominated this engagement? A. Superior American defensive positions and training. B. Russian tactical errors and poor execution. C. Covert deployment of classified autonomous underwater vehicle system that Russian intelligence didn't detect and Russian doctrine couldn't counter. The answer is C. American positions and training mattered. Russian execution was adequate. But decisive factor was classified weapons system that Russian planning hadn't accounted for, because intelligence didn't know it existed. 8,000 Russian naval infantry suffered catastrophic casualties because they assaulted island defended by weapons system that destroyed their landing craft and ships faster than Russian forces could adapt. Autonomous underwater vehicles, networked with shore defenses, created integrated defensive system that Russian amphibious doctrine wasn't designed to overcome. 4,000 Russian casualties resulted from tactical surprise created by covert deployment of advanced system that tactical intelligence failed to detect before assault. Can adversaries defend against such technological surprises? Not easily. Classified weapons programs, by definition, aren't known to opponents until revealed through employment. Intelligence can sometimes detect hints of advanced systems under development, but cannot reliably identify all classified capabilities opponents might deploy. Russian intelligence apparently had no indication Americans possessed operational, autonomous, underwater vehicle capability on island. Without that knowledge, Russian planning was based on incorrect assessment of defensive capabilities, creating conditions where assault-faced threats planners hadn't prepared forces to counter. Only defenses assuming opponents might possess advanced capabilities intelligence hasn't detected. But such conservative assumption makes planning nearly impossible, because forces cannot prepare for unknown threats doctrine doesn't address. What does this mean for future amphibious operations? Attackers face fundamental uncertainty about whether defenders possess classified capabilities that could make operations catastrophically costly. Russian experience demonstrates amphibious assault against prepared defender is extremely risky when technological surprise is possible. Future amphibious doctrine must account for possibility. Defenders might employ unexpected systems that could devastate assault forces. But accounting for the unknown capabilities is paradox that doctrine cannot resolve. You cannot prepare for threats you don't know exist. That creates advantage for defenders who can covertly deploy advanced systems, creating tactical surprise that offensive doctrine cannot adequately prepare attackers to handle. This engagement proved that amphibious warfare in modern era faces challenges beyond conventional analysis of force ratios and firepower. Russian naval infantry with numerical superiority and adequate fire support were destroyed by American defensive system their intelligence hadn't detected. 14 hours of bloodiest amphibious combat since World War II resulted in Russian catastrophic defeat, demonstrating that covert deployment of advanced defensive technologies can decisively defeat amphibious assault, regardless of attackers' numerical advantages. 4,000 casualties taught Russian military devastating lesson about risks of amphibious operations when defenders might possess classified capabilities intelligence cannot detect and doctrine cannot counter. American victory proved temporary technological advantages through covert deployment remain decisive even when opponents have superior numbers and adequate doctrine for conventional amphibious warfare. Subscribe to The Navy Chronicle, where naval power meets historical reality, where 8,000 Russian naval infantry demonstrate amphibious assault risks when facing classified defensive systems intelligence failed to detect, where bloodiest modern amphibious battle proves covert technological deployment creates decisive advantages conventional doctrine cannot overcome, where 14 hours of combat teaches lessons about operational security and technological surprise determining outcomes. When defenders employ capabilities attackers didn't know existed until catastrophic tactical employment revealed them.